Welcome to Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, where we discuss pertinent issues of peace and sustainability around the world and across Africa. Today, we'll be talking about a very important topic, which is the philosophy of H. Odera Oruka. And the speaker is Professor Gail Presbey. She's the professor of philosophy at the University of Detroit, Mercy, in the United States of America. And she's also director of the James Carney Latin American Solidarity Archives, among many other positions she holds. And she's a prolific writer. She has written a lot, many books and articles, including the book on the life and thought of H. Odera Oruka. And we are so happy to have you, Gail Presbey. And I think last time we met during the conference that took place here in Tanzania on Ujamaa, Ubuntu, and New Pan-Africanisms and the future of world peace. And she made a brilliant presentation. And so we are so glad to have you again with us, this time in Global Peace Studies. And I welcome one and all. Thank you for being here with us today. So I welcome you, Gail, to start your presentation. And so I can see that you've already shared your slide, so you can actually proceed from that. Thank you very much. And we are looking forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
And thank you so much for inviting me. And it's great that you have this series talking about peace in Africa. And thanks to my friend Janet Gerson, she's the one who told me about your series. And I'm so grateful that I'm able to join. And I'm going to tell you about a project, a person who I've been researching for about 30 years, ever since I met him in the mid-1990s. That's a professor from Kenya, H. Odera Oruka. So let me see if my slides will move. Yes. And so this is one of the early photos I have of him when he was attending St. Mary's High School in Yala. And he went from St. Mary's to Uppsala to do his studies. First, he was studying geology, earth sciences, because that's what the scholarship was for. But his real love was philosophy, as he found out when he met other students there and when he met Professor Ingemar Hedenius. Now, I want to argue, and I do argue in my book at greater length, that his interest in philosophy actually started as a child when he was growing up in Uganda, because his father was a sage. And he writes about his father, and he includes his father in a book he'll later write called Sage Philosophy. So his father was one of many who would gather together to discuss the issues facing the community. And they would do so very philosophically. They would talk about values, traditions, change. They talked about values like sustainable development. I'm not sure they used that catchphrase, but that's exactly the kind of issues they were concerned about. How are we going to thrive? How are all the members of our community going to have enough to eat? And I was happy to come with him and interview some sages, including Nyando Ayu of Sega, who talked about his mission. So Odera Oruka took me to meet Nyando Ayu, and together we talked about how it was Ayu's mission to bring water to travelers and make sure they had enough food. And so I want to suggest that these were key values of his childhood. And when he went to university, he had a chance to explore these more in the academic field of philosophy. So as I said, I was able to meet him first in 1993 and again in 1995. And he encouraged me to come to Kenya repeatedly and to do research on his sage philosophy and issues in Africa. And so I was happy to do it. Now, there's much that could be said about his whole life, but I'm just going to cover a part of it in this talk. And even so, this might be a little ambitious, but this is not covering all of his philosophy. But considering this is a series looking at the issues of peace and justice in Africa, I thought I would take a look at what he's written about punishment, retribution, and or alternatives to retribution, like compensation, issues of liberty, political liberty, personal liberty, Africa's post-colonial condition and the global injustices, as well as his commentary on violence, war, and Gandhi's nonviolent alternatives. So I'll try to give you an overview of his key ideas on this point. And this will actually follow, the first three will follow some of his early writings, his master's thesis, his licentiate PhD thesis, and his autobiographical novel, which were those three written in the 60s and 70s. But I will go to one of the last things he wrote in his life to address the fourth issue. And the things I'll share with you today come from some earlier publications of mine. So I first wrote about some of these issues in 2015 in the magazine Polylog. Those were incorporated along with further studies in my recent book, which just came out with Bloomsbury in 2023. So Ingemar Hedenius was a professor at Uppsala, and he was, I argue in the book, and I think the record shows, he was a big influence on Oruka. He was a Swedish philosopher. And what was he known for? So he was a person who defended the idea of the welfare state, and this is a robust welfare state. This isn't like a minimalized squeak by in poverty on welfare. This is a state that is committed to ensuring that all of its members have adequate food and medicine and housing. And Hedenius proposed this in the context of Sweden, where he had critics on both the left and the right. So some Marxist critics who thought, all private property should be abolished. And then you had, the right, which was more on individuals take care of themselves. So he saw himself as promoting a middle way. In different contexts, the middle is different places. So I'm trying to tell you that the context of the middle back when Hedenius was writing. And Hedenius was a professor in the Department of Philosophy, and the Department of Philosophy had two tracks, and he was in the one called Practical Philosophy. So he was always convinced philosophy has to make a difference in people's lives. It has to address their real needs. And he's the kind of philosopher who wrote a weekly column in a newspaper. Now, I want to say that was also an influence on Odera Oruka, because he also often would write in the Kenyan newspapers about the issues of the day, and he would try to show how those issues are related. He would share his philosophical reflections and, in a way, try to guide Kenyan society, what they were thinking, what they were valuing. He would try to guide them in his writings. So one of the writings of Hydenius, the welfare state and its ideals, he talked about that. He had an idea of the welfare state based on utilitarian ideals. The goal is the lessening of poverty. So, the utilitarian maxim, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, very kind of populist. Make sure the wealth is spread. Make sure the happiness of everyone is taken into account. And it's also a very materialistic idea, prioritizing people's material needs, but also democratic, right? So these were some of his key ideas. And he also addressed this topic of retribution. And so in 1963, he talked about what he thought was an erroneous idea. And he critiqued this from a utilitarian materialist point of view. And he said, there's this crazy idea that a person who has harmed someone or committed a crime should be made to suffer. This is the idea behind retribution, perhaps the Kantian idea. And the utilitarian idea is going to be against that. And according to Hydenius, this is just erroneous thinking because the condemning of criminals always involves an erroneous reporting of causality. So according to Hydenius, right, and he would use this example of billiards. Okay, so what makes a billiard ball move? Now you might think, oh, it's moved by somebody who's hitting that ball with a stick. But that's not the only thing that makes them move. It's not the only thing that predicts how they will move. There are many other factors. The weight of the balls, the shape of the balls, the table's quality, gravity, all of these things together cause what happens. But we only focus on one little part, the stick pushing. Okay. The same erroneous idea of causality is involved in what we think about criminals. Because what an individual does is part of it, but there's also the community that individual comes from, the community's laws and material conditions, its traditions and its prejudices. All of these things play a role. But the whole justice system often minimizes these and just focuses on the individual. Now, so Hydenius was the mentor for Odera Oruka, both for his bachelor's degree with honors at Uppsala, and then he came to Wayne State University because Hydenius came to Wayne State as a visiting professor. He was able to get Odera Oruka a position as a graduate student assistant. And so Odera Oruka came to my city here, Detroit. He finished his master's degree and he wrote on this very topic, the concept of punishment and its abolition. That's his master's thesis, which formed the core text for something he would later publish as a book, Punishment and Terrorism in Africa, in 1976. And he published that in Kenya when he returned to Kenya. Now, after Wayne State, Odera Oruka returned with Hydenius back to Uppsala, worked on his licentiate, his PhD thesis on the liberty and the subjection of mankind. And that was later developed as his book, The Philosophy of Liberty, Essays on Political Philosophy. Okay. So first I'm going to talk about his ideas, both in the master's and in the book that came from his master's degree. Now, Odera Oruka wrote an autobiographical article called My Strange Way to Philosophy. And in there, he has this quote, which I think is helpful. He's giving an account of how his own ideas built up over time and how in the 1960s he had a lot of hope. So many African countries got their independence. It was a time when, Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, they were finally gaining their liberation. But then he says, in the 70s and 80s, that hope had vanished. And he says, my reading and literature and philosophy has convinced me that although some may by chance be more gifted than others, the great divide between the mentally creative and non-creative persons lies in socioeconomic reality. Socioeconomic deprivation, with its accompaniments, poverty and hunger, is the greatest constraint to mental development and creativity. So this is something he argued throughout his life, but he first articulated it here in his master's thesis in the context of this issue of crime, poverty, and punishment or alternatives to punishment. In his thesis, he says, right, for the majority of impoverished persons struggling for survival, the law is encountered as a constant interference in survival. And there's constant temptation to transgress. So there may be people who make their living from garbage picking, and maybe there's a law. You can't go in there and garbage pick. And not that that's how they want to make their living, but they're desperate. So they're in constant temptation to transgress the law. So the law is going to be harder on the poor struggling for survival. Especially depending on who's written those laws, from which point of view, because a democratically based legal system can be better. So when Oruka's writing his master's thesis, and he's writing in the 1960s, and he's in Detroit, and he's quoting Marx, and other Marxists like Marcuse, and he's arguing capitalism greatly increases crime. And if there was a higher level of crime among African American neighborhoods in Detroit as he was there, he found the source is in this deprivation and this improper wealth distribution, where some have more than they need and others have not enough. And that would always have to be taken into account if you're looking at any particular criminal act. So again, he's agreeing with Hedenius here. And he goes, what is the goal of society? We need an egalitarian society. And that would not just be a distribution of wealth, but feelings of superiority or inferiority would have to be addressed. The gap between the rich and the poor have to be changed. And there has to be freedom from hatred, racial hatred, tribal, communal, anything. And he always said there should be treatment for criminals. And when he says treatment, it's interesting. He has this example. He goes, the only rule for police in my ideal society would be if a person who's suffering needs help getting into the ambulance where they can go to a hospital and get treatment. He said something like that. So, and he thought that if people would realize criminals need treatment instead of punishment, there would be more compassion for them, more respect for them. And plus, this would challenge society to change its structures so that it addresses and meets people's basic needs. Okay. All right. Now, as I mentioned, when Odera Oruka finished his studies again at Uppsala, went back to Kenya, became a teacher at University of Nairobi, he published this book, and Hedenius wrote a book review about the book when it came out. This is a translation. that one of the philosophy professors from Uppsala translated this passage of Hedenius for me. And you'll see here that he went beyond his master's thesis and applied a lot of these ideas to post-colonial Africa, where he was very worried that, and I used to see this in the newspapers when I was in Kenya, somebody steals a sack of grain or, something they need from a local store. They are thrown into jail, right? In the meantime, there's the white collar crimes of the rich and powerful and connected, who they're either getting away with it, or when they do, they're getting a slap on the wrist, or crooked judges are letting them go. And these are some of the topics that Oruka tackled directly in his thesis. Now, I had a chance to talk to Father Donders, who was in the philosophy department same time as Oruka, collaborated with Oruka on some projects, and Donders talked about, what were his impressions of Odera Oruka? Typical Luo, straight up like a pencil, dressed like a gentleman, flower in his buttonhole. But what did he really care about? He was always teaching ethics. One of his favorite topics was the death penalty. He was always fighting against the death penalty. Okay, so these were the kind of big impressions he made on his colleagues. So now I want to move to some of the things he said in his licentiate PhD thesis from Uppsala, and he was taking a look at the history of this concept of liberty as he could find it throughout the centuries in philosophy, and adding his critique, right? So there were earlier philosophers who focused on this idea of freedom of the mind. You can be imprisoned and still your mind can be free. Not only Plotinus in the Origin, but we might think of Epictetus, or we might think of Boethius, these imprisoned philosophers who emphasize freedom of the mind. And he says the problem with these ideas is they ignore the difficult conditions of material existence for the many poor. How is a slave in chains free in any relevant sense? Or how could you say that God, my religion and God gives me freedom while ignoring material conditions? Now, of course, the early church Christians, they were facing the lions. Maybe they thought, we need this belief that God will save us because we're about to be torn apart. But Odera Oruka's part is you have to stop being torn apart. You have to stop those things happening, right, in the Colosseum. You have to stop the unjust imprisonments. Mental and intellectual liberties could not be achieved by ignoring social realities. And so, also sticking with the utilitarian bent of Hedenius, he has a criticism of Kant's idea of a moral law that's indifferent to benefits. Because, Kant is like, just think of moral duty, don't think of consequences. And Oruka said, Kant forgot that morality and freedom are issues only in a collective existence, a society. And societies exist only for the sole purpose of ensuring or fulfilling certain human ends or desires. Now, these aren't just desires to eat or to have shelter. Human beings have layers and layers of more sophisticated desires that have to do with human fulfillment. And that's part of what he talks about in his book on liberty. I can't go through the whole thing. I'm just trying to get a few of the highlights of the books, right? What about Hobbes's Leviathan? A government should not offer security and nothing else to its citizenry, because security itself is conditional on social welfare. So a government must care about social welfare. Now he's seeing, examples like Sweden, where this is a big concern of the government and where they are to a great extent meeting it. And he's going back, he saw in the US, there wasn't that same dedication to doing that, especially not across race lines. And then he goes to Kenya and he sees, again, a post-colonial elite that's not meeting the needs of the people. Okay. And he's got a critique of capitalism here too, because he's worried that Mill's emphasis on freedom. Now Odera Oruka cares about liberty, but someone like John Stuart Mill, this can lead to free trade, free enterprise, and then you have monopoly capitalism. And with that comes the expansion of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so anyway, you can't have wealth and privileges limited to a small group. Okay. Now, political freedom is a very important thing, but the independence that African countries get in 1963, etc., that isn't the A to Z of freedom. Political freedom is limited by economic dependence. And he's noticing things and writing about things like a country like the United States can force other countries to agree with it at the United Nations. So this is where, the political freedoms are hindered. They're limited by power relations. And he's commenting that African Americans don't have effective political freedom, even if they have freedom of speech. Now, they do have some, and it's important they exercise the political freedom they have. But, they're limited by their numbers and their wealth in a political context that lets things like wealth interfere in politics. And by the way, Odera Oruka travels to the U.S. He meets Lucius Outlaw, who comes to Africa and then invites Odera Oruka to the U.S., and he gets involved in the philosophy born of struggle. Okay, now I want to tell you about another early writing of Odera Oruka's. It's an autobiographical novel he wrote in the mid-1970s. And I want to thank Tommy Zane for having put this in his safekeeping after Odera Oruka asked him, please keep it in safekeeping. He also asked Tommy Zane to read it over because Tommy and Odera Oruka and all their friends from graduate school, many of them were characters in the novel. They all were given different names. But as Zane explained, it was thinly veiled autobiography put forward as a novel. And it especially covers the year that Odera Oruka had was a visiting senior lecturer at University of Ibadan, 1976 to 77. And so Odera Oruka, he was very committed to staying in Africa. And he even turned down a job offer he had in Florida because he wanted to be back in Kenya. So when it came time for him to have a sabbatical, he didn't just want to go abroad to England or something. Although he did go to Sweden 1 month, England 1 month, and then he spent 10 months in Nigeria. And he learned a lot there and developed a lot of his ideas on African philosophy there. And I'm actually not even sharing, for time constraints, that part. But anyway, but I want to say that in this thinly veiled autobiography, he's actually talking about his philosophy. And so in this book, he portrays himself as a character named Omolo. And, so he starts out by Omolo is explaining why he doesn't want to go to the U.S. on his sabbatical. He goes, I've been there. And he goes, do you know there are blocks infested by rats? So he's trying to knock this idea of, America's the perfect country. It's suffering a lot of problems. But he goes, the real reason to stay is to stay in Africa is because Africa needs people committed to making Africa better. And his novel doesn't romanticize Africa either. Africa's challenges, Africa's flaws have to be addressed. So he's not going to paint a pretty picture of any of these places. Maybe Sweden gets a prettier picture than the others. And Omolo, the main character, he talks about his experience in Kenya and all the problems of corruption, even in the education system, with pressure on him to admit unqualified students and how he's harassed by police at checkpoint. So he's coming from Kenya, but he knows Kenya has a lot of problems. But he talks about Sweden, the efficient bus system, automation, safety, cleanliness, and that they have a low crime rate due to fair distribution of wealth. So he shows himself singing the praises of Sweden there. Okay. And he says, and I have a quote, man cannot perpetually live on lies and self-deception without ruining himself and those who believe. So it's very much a let's take stock. Let's say what's really going on. So then when he gets to Ibadan, he mentions so many problems he has, which we presume, and it's a novel, but we presume it's based. He can't even get his housing straight. He has a huge problem opening a bank account to get his bank allowance from University of Ibadan. None of the people in the bank will help him. None of the civil servants will help him. And he's really frustrated, but he sees people who are even more impoverished than him coming to the same institutions, trying to get a little something that would save their lives, and they're being turned away. And so he really wants this to change about Africa. And then he also comments in this novel about people who are dejected. They just they figure you can't change the system. The system's too big. And they just share with each other their wisdom on how to get around these roadblocks or how to manipulate things just to survive in this kind of system that isn't working. And so in some dramatic moments in the book, he says, he sees a man beaten to death, accused of witchcraft. And this is one of the low points of the character Omolo, who's going, and he's expressing his frustration with people remaining silent in the face of tyranny. And he says, and I wept. I cursed Africa. I cursed inefficiency, bureaucracy, and red tape. The man dies not only in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny. So he's quoting Soyinka. The man dies also every time we acquiesce in inefficiency and senseless bureaucracy. The man dies as well every time we reject rationality as being alien and instead believe in superstitions, myths, and magic. So these are some of the things his character says in this autobiographical novel. Okay. So then what will restore dignity and self-worth to Africans? And he thinks that the problem has to be addressed on an international level, right? Because the international economic and political situation in Africa is having bad effects in Africa and on self-pride. And so he has in this book a critique of foreign aid. He says foreign aid is a kind of foreign begging, and begging is detrimental to one's self-worth. Without a moral reason to beg, a person loses dignity. In foreign aid, the receiver wears the rags of a beggar, and the donor the mantle of a benevolent king. Okay. Now, he's not saying Africa doesn't need help, but he does not like the scenario that is you could say, putting down African countries, like, why can't they feed themselves? What's wrong with them? In a situation where the international economic and political order is stacked against Africa. So then in his novel, his character is drawing on Frantz Fanon and Walter Rodney to say the problem is the European and American countries are doing well because they reaped the benefits of colonialism for decades, for centuries. But he doesn't want that to turn into saying we're just victims the rest of our life. Because he goes, now that African countries have their independence, they have to take responsibility for their own inefficiency and callousness and bureaucracy in public service. And so I suggest that as you read this autobiographical novel, you can hear the echoes of the philosophy papers that Odera Oruka has written then, and since then, he develops all these ideas, submits them to philosophy journals. For example, his article, The Philosophy of Foreign Aid. So his autobiographical novel is called In the Mother Africa, the Family Broke Down, but his solutions, he wants to find solutions on an international level. And now, for my fourth part, I'm just going to fast forward to one of the last things Odera Oruka wrote, because I want to say those are some of the earlier things. I'm skipping over many years. You'd have to read the whole book. But if we go fast forward, 1995, when Odera Oruka so unfortunately died at too young an age in a road accident. So one of the last things he wrote was an article about it was 1995, and he was looking at all the changes in South Africa in 1994. And so those things meant a lot to him. And so he was very interested in at the same time that South Africa is winning its independence, there's still other wars, there's still other suffering, there's still internal violence, there's still political opponents being imprisoned. So there's a lot of problems of war, but there's also this example where the South African struggle has gotten gains and they have gotten rid of the apartheid system. So what are the kinds of things he says in 95? And it's important to realize that prior to writing this, looking through so many of the things he wrote over the decades, he was always quoting Fanon, and not Gandhi so much, but now he's trying to bring in Gandhi too. And so he says, right, violence has led to a vicious circle of violence, escalating to an inferno. And here's a quote from him. And so even a very acute and insightful observer fails to see what reasonable ultimate ethical moral justification there is for any use of violence for change. The very value of humanity gets lost in the continual practice and history of violence. Africa should perhaps now turn and apply Gandhi rather than Fanon. So these were some of the things he was thinking about, and not only thinking about Fanon, but also about Mandela and how Mandela also was influenced by Fanon. So at that time, it's the end of apartheid. Mandela's the new president, and he even asks, well, is that the fruit of years of violent struggle? Does that mean that violence is what got South Africa its independence? And he says, no, if you take a look at the peaceful transition in South Africa, It was due to a great peaceful compromise that should be emulated everywhere. That's what Oruka says in his 95 article. He judges the success of the current compromise because he thinks it best fulfills the utilitarian maxim of increasing happiness for increasing numbers of persons. Now, does he fully embrace Gandhi's position of nonviolence? He mentions all the things he agrees with on Gandhi, and maybe one or two small points he disagrees with. So what does he agree with? Okay, and he says really he himself is writing this in 95 that Gandhi and Fanon have a lot of things in common. They both had peace and the welfare of humanity as their highest goals. And Oruka considers himself a humanist and says, well, Gandhi is also a humanist because Gandhi identified God with humanity, particularly the starving millions. He saw within Gandhi's concern for people's economic well-being a version of his own emphasis on fulfilling an economic moral minimum. In other words, Gandhi cared for the bodies of the poor, not only their souls, as some other religious persons might hold. And so he also succinctly sums up Gandhi's monistic worldview, which states that we are all one, and that because of this, any violence I might perpetrate on others would be felt by myself. So he sums up this Gandhian monistic view, and then he says this view is consistent with his own view as articulated in his article, Parental Earth Ethics. Now, if you go to that article, Parental Earth Ethics, you'll see that he talks about different bases for environmental ethics. And he has a co-author, Callistus Juma. They talk about this idea of all of the environment interrelated and impacting each other. And so I can't get into that whole, but that he alludes to his work on environmental philosophy, and he sees it as being related to Gandhi's monism. And Oruka likes this metaphor of parental earth ethics because he likes to think of the whole earth as a family. And so that family has some relationship with monism. Now, it's a bigger question about whether he's completely a monist, as Gandhi said. Here, I think he's just drawing connections between his own philosophy and Gandhi's. And he also likes Gandhi's concept of truth. Because Oruka says of Gandhi's view, we are all members of the same family, the same reality. Truth is both in me and in all others. Truth is there even in our enemy. And truth is God, or God is truth. And it is our duty to bring out truth in others. Okay, the nonviolent method is capable of bringing out truth even in our adversaries. Okay, so Oruka, someone very committed to truth, likes this. The only thing he mentions that he might disagree with Gandhi is Oruka likes a good philosophical argument. Now, is a good philosophical argument violent or nonviolent? I would say it all depends on how you do it, of course. And the ideal of philosophical argument is done with respect for your opponent. You expect you are going to learn something from them. Okay, so I just wanted to end this talk by referring to this last writing of his that came out posthumously in a collection called Practical Philosophy. And here I've just tried to share with you some highlights of aspects of Oruka's philosophy that I think are most directly related to these issues of peace and justice, with all my apologies for not being able to mention all the other wonderful things he also said on this topic that I'd be happy to discuss in any question and answers. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Gail Presbey, for this wonderful presentation. You have made us really feel like we are all philosophers. And so it's great that intellecting has started. I think probably, philosophy, some people, I should say. However, you've made it really sound like good music, and it's really nice listening to you.
Thanks.
And you've said that more because of the time constraint, but I can assure you that we are going to create another time for you in the future if you can. So now I'd like to invite people to share their own experiences, ask questions, make comments. So you are all welcome to ask a question or make a comment. And I can see from Madeline saying, for a beautiful presentation. Please ask your question or share your comment as we let this great presentation sink in. Janet.
Hello, Gail. I so appreciated your presentation, and I was wondering if you could put the name of your book in the chat, and also the name of the last publication of Oruka in the chat. The name of those two things in the chat, so we can pursue this topic farther. And I really appreciated the slow speed and clarity with which you presented, so I could write everything down, because I found each part of the presentation so significant and relevant to my thinking. And my question is sort of self-centered, in that I don't know that everyone would be interested in it, but because I so appreciate your historical, your you gave a sort of survey of philosophy in there. And I would like to hear again the Haruko's critique of Kant, because I didn't quite understand it, and I think I could use that. Thank you. So,
Okay, well, so you might know that, I mean, in general, often Kantian utilitarianism are seen as kind of competitors. Now, there are some philosophers like Jim Sturba who said, by now the Kantians have modified and the utilitarians have modified, and you can actually have a middle position, between these two. But oftentimes philosophers think they have to take one side or the other. And one thing that Kantians say, and if you look at what Kant said is right, you just figure out what your moral duty is and you just do it, regardless of the consequences. Because he thought paying attention to the consequences, you could get waylaid and say, oh, I better stop doing my duty because it's having bad consequences. You tell the truth, people end up in jail. You go, oh, maybe I should lie so my friends don't end up in jail. But and I'll tell you, and Gandhi often holds the same kind of Kantian view, which is you do your nonviolent action, you end up in jail. Don't let that deter you. Hold on to the truth as you know it. So but the utilitarians are like, what is life for, right? People need to eat. People need their needs, even their higher needs, fulfilled. And so we need the utilitarians pay attention to those consequences. So Hedenius, Oruka, and other utilitarians would say, you can't just ignore consequences. It's a way of acting like the body isn't as important, and those bodily material needs, from Oruka's point of view, it almost sounds like Maslow, but right now I can't remember if he ever quoted Maslow. You need your basic needs met in order to have the security you need in order to fill those higher needs, which we also have. And so that was his critique of Kant.
Thank you. So clear. You're so clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both. And another question is,
George, you were breaking up. Can you try that again?
oh, I see. All right. So Magdalene, please. And then we go to Yao Mesan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gail, for your presentation. If you can hear me clearly, it was very beautiful. And I am from Nigeria. I've read a lot of Wole Soyinka, but I just haven't, I have not met his work, Odeka's work. And I am really moved to read him and to really maybe understand further. But I have a question on violence. Having been born from Nigeria and from an environment that is constantly exposed to violence, of extractivism and poverty and hunger. And I have a question on what is violence. Because I was reading a book by Festus Iyayi, one of the prominent writers then in Nigeria who died, and he wrote on violence. One thing I got from his definition of violence was, he said here that when one public hospital in the same society, one patient can sleep in a large air-conditioned room, whereas other ordinary patients, men, women, children, have to sleep in corridors, on mats, on hard, cold, and rough cemented floors. And this is violent. He further said that where a man has enough to feed himself, his dogs, cats, children, and monkeys, and many other men are weak and thin from hunger, and their children are suffering from all kinds of sicknesses. This is violent. My question is from the last point where Odeka said that perhaps we should turn to Gandhi's rather than Fanon. I just want to understand what would be your definition of violence? And also considering the fact that most African countries gain independence through warfare, violence warfare. What is violence in this context? And how do we apply Gandhi's, how do we apply Gandhi in today's political setting, economic settings, which is ridden by violence? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that question. So, right now, I don't exactly know where Odera defines violence, but I think I could draw on other authors, other philosophers of nonviolence like Barry Gann, and talk about violence as the actions due to intention to harm. So whenever we want to harm someone, and it could be just thwarting them from their goal, it could be physically harming them, The same action, cutting someone with a knife, if you're a surgeon doing it to save someone's life, that wouldn't be an act of violence. But if you're trying to threaten someone, that is an act of violence. So violence intends to harm, and that harm could be psychological, belittling, it could be physical, uh, emotional. The things you've mentioned about society are, those cases that you mentioned, those are illustrations of violence. So if there are disparities in healthcare, some get the most wonderful healthcare, sanitary conditions, staff 24/7 waiting on them, and others are either languishing in an under-resourced hospital or not even able to get to the hospital. That would be violence. You don't have to have somebody's hand on a scalpel, for something to be violence. These can be systemic structural violences. And Odera Oruka was always trying to point out these violences, right? So unemployment, underpaying workers, racial segregation that made it hard for people to get to jobs. All of these things are part of a system of injustice, which would breed more violence. For example, an individual criminal act, he would argue, would come from those violences already having visited the person. Now, we can change it around, and he wanted to change it around. Now, when I mentioned that there was a debate between Gandhi and Fanon, and he says, let's try Gandhi more. But he says, remember that Gandhi and Fanon agree on a lot of points. They both care. So, it's just like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. They agree on a lot of points. Some people like to say they're the opposites. But in my philosophy, I look for some common ground. They both say we have to do whatever we can to change the system to reduce these violences, both the interpersonal and the systemic. Now, Gandhi wanted to use nonviolent means to reduce the violence because he was worried that choosing violent means would, you could say, be counterproductive because it would just mean that some violence would come back at a certain point. Now, in the history of Africa, there have been a wide range of experiences with independence, and some of them did use violence. And so, Fanon was living from Martinique, but was living in Algeria. So that was a place that used violence. But we have Kwame Nkrumah, who used nonviolence, and we have Pounda, we have Julius Nyerere. So it could be said that there is also a history of nonviolence working in Africa. And so at that moment, when South Africa in '94 is getting its liberation from South Africa, the question was, do we credit violence or do we credit nonviolence with that win for the South African people? And, lots of people have lots of different views. And some might say it was Umkhonto we if we didn't do that. And others will say 95% of that movement was nonviolence. If it wasn't for the thousands and thousands of people engaged in nonviolent action, it wouldn't have happened. And in fact, I've written an article about that debate. So, and I welcome you to, I'd be happy to send it to you. I'll have to, at a certain point, put both my email in the chat. I also have a web page where you can get a lot of my articles online for free. But so that's a big topic, but there's two sides to the story. I can just mention Matt Meyer and Bill Sutherland's book, Guns and Gandhi in Africa. They take a lot of look at the way in which nonviolence is being used in Africa. And I know George knows Matt Meyer. You just had hosted him there recently at your conference. And but he does a lot of work on this topic. So thank you for that question. I hope I answered your key points.
Thank you.
Can I speak? Hello.
George, maybe,
George is
are
muted.
you there,
I
George?
think okay. So I think when before Magdalene speaks, he said it in the order. First Magdalene, then I.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very
I
much.
do know my friends. Can I? Hello. Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. I was saying thank you, Prof, for the presentation. I really enjoy listening to it because of two reasons. It is the first time for me hearing a name of a philosopher, Oruka, from Kenya. And it made me a little bit sad because I'm from Togo, and going to school in Togo, studying either reading philosophy, literature, history, whatever you did, you hardly come across names like this. But we hear more of Western philosophers or intellectuals, and obviously the reason is the colonial agenda that is still ongoing and even up to now. And I really, because you mentioned it that Odera Oruka, he categorically decided to stay in Africa and to impact knowledge in Africa. But then we almost don't know about him in Africa. I'm from Africa. I'm from Togo, but hardly do we come across such names in school programs or any other intellectual activity. So is he being naive? Because I know he knows more of this thing than we do know. Because at the time he was living, that was during the Moi, the long-serving dictator of Kenya at that time. That was mostly during Moi administration. And then it's the same period that his colleague, almost we can say, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, has to flee out of the country because of the whole political thing. So sometimes the will is there. Some people wish they could do more, but then it's just not possible. So I don't know if Oruka, by deciding to impact knowledge in Africa, is he being naive? Will you say something like that? And then the second question will be, I'm currently writing my thesis on a philosopher from the 18th century, which is called Anton Wilhelm Amo. And it is almost the same story. I never knew of that name going to school in Africa or going to school in Togo, I may say, or I live in Ghana also for some times, and you won't hear anything like that, you know. And it goes back to the same colonial continuation. So is it possible? Will it come to an end at some point, or like what could be the solution for that? Those would be my two questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. So, yes, the only way I found out about Odera Oruka is because I went to a conference, Philosophy Born of Struggle, in New York City, and a Professor Lucius Outlaw was there. And he told me, Gail, you should go to Kenya and study Odera Oruka. And he knew that because he was, as an African American philosophy professor, he was very interested in making connections between African philosophy scholars and African American philosophy scholars. And he had a series of conferences bringing over Kwasi Wiredu and others. Mudimbi would join them, and they would discuss what are the common issues across the ocean between African American and African scholars. And so he knew Odera Oruka. And it's also Outlaws Network helped African scholars get to know each other. But they also got to know each other because in this university system, there's always the need for an external examiner. And so you would have all these philosophy students at Nairobi, and their papers would have to be examined. And they would fly Kwasi Wiredu from Ghana to Kenya to read over the papers. And so this is how Odera Oruka met people. There's also a group called the World Congress of Philosophy. I just attended their conference a few weeks ago in Rome. And philosophers come from all around the world. And African philosophers could meet each other there. It could be Turkey, you know, who knows where the conference is. And Africans are meeting each other there because it's a world gathering. And just recently, I mean, Workina was there. So I see my Ethiopian philosophy friends in Rome at the conference, Nigerian friends, South African, Mohave Ramosa. So the African philosophers can meet each other, exchange ideas at these international conferences, and sometimes also at conferences hosted. We had a conference when I was in Kenya in 2000. We had a conference. Ethiopians came, Ugandans came. And so there are these, but that doesn't mean that everybody knows them, because it's true, as you say, that in general, African philosophy works in obscurity compared to European philosophy. And there are so many universities in Africa that got their curriculum from European universities, and they're repeating the European history of philosophy, but that is being challenged at the World Congress and elsewhere. Workina can tell you they created a graduate program in Addis Ababa that's focused on African philosophy. But the other thing I wanted to say is Odera Oruka also didn't want philosophy just to be for people at the university. He didn't just want to talk to other philosophy professors. He wanted African philosophy to be for everyone. And he had a big project called Sage Philosophy, which I haven't had a chance to talk about yet. But he had graduate students and helpers of his go into the rural areas and interview the wise elders of Kenya and put together those interviews in a book along with the academic commentary. The book was called Sage Philosophy. And he says in grants that he wrote to get money to do his research, he goes, this is part of the national cultural heritage of Kenya. And he goes, why don't I, as a Luo, know the wisdom of the Kikuyu elders and the elders in the Luyas in Kamagamba? Why don't we, and Meru, why don't we know it? We're here in Kenya. We have wise elders. We're not studying them in the university, and Kenyans aren't learning from the wisdom of each other in their own country. And so the Sage Philosophy Project was supposed to address that. So he wasn't only about trying to get his own name known. He wanted known the names of the many wise persons of Kenya. So we just need to change the curriculum, not only in Africa, but also in Europe. And there are some organizations that are committed to doing that. And some of them have websites, which I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to put them here because I'm answering questions, but there are some. I'll link you up. I'll put my email there. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Gail. And now we go to Dasu and then Richard, right? Oh, Richard first. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon.
Yami.
Thank you so much, Prof. Your treatment is really moving and then quite what is it? Mind what is it? Engaging. This who wins this conflict? Someone in a well structured office with a condition with a very large, as my dear sister said, and then what thinking about 5,000 needy, 5,000 people, thinking about them, how to make them what is it, achieve a certain target, and someone who is also in just a normal room, normal office, thinking of becoming such a person. Who wins when conflict rises between these two? Who do you think will win? Please, do you? I guess you understand what I'm trying to come up. But,
I hope so. I mean, it broke up a little bit when I was trying to hear you.
Maybe politicians or.
Will nonviolence win out, or will violence win out? Is that your question?
Yeah. It's about violence. Maybe I'm a politician riding in a V8 luxurious car, and then another person is somewhere, maybe an ordinary what is it, civil servant, quite complaining harder about these two scenarios. And I want to ask that who would win if there's a what is it, a conflict between these two people? The one in maybe a luxurious environment, thinking about a very big what is it? Thinking about a large area of problem, and then the one without such environment, such a luxurious environment, thinking only about how he or she would become what is it, successful in future. These two, who do you think would win when there is a conflict between them, as we normally complain? I get. Please, you get my what I'm trying to put across.
Okay, I will try my best to answer your question. So
thank you.
It's true that some people, and they could be politicians in power, they could be the rich or the well-off, isolate themselves from the problems of the world because they're surrounded in a small bubble of luxury, or even the middle class can just isolate themselves by saying, I just won't go to that side of town. You know, there's problems with poverty. Oh, it's on that side of town. I'll just stay here. I'll avoid it. But I mean, that I would say is short-sighted, because we need to come together as a community and address issues and not just have a blinder's view, because problems can fester and get larger. So the nonviolent approach works best when it's proactive. And when you see problems coming up on the horizon and you decide to address them early. It's always like, oh, once you know everything's gone crazy, it's like, oh, how are you going to be nonviolent now? Well, we had opportunities to avoid this violence earlier. We should address them. But also the person who's in encapsulated in a bubble of luxury, is harming themselves because they aren't seeing the truth. Remember, for Gandhi, right? Truth is God. So if I'm in a comfortable lie and I'm out of touch with reality, am I even living? So we can doubt the benefit to being in that artificial bubble. We can realize that getting out of that and seeing the world from a greater view, multiple perspectives, is truer. Now, can politicians use nonviolence? I think maybe that was part of your question, if I heard it. It's harder. So if you get into political office and then there's problems in your country. Now, I mean, I agree with Michael Nagler, violence always works. If you mean works, you mean in the long run. But sometimes it's hard to say it's going to work as a quick fix, but that's why we need programs of nonviolence. I've also written an article about how several of the African leaders who got independence for their countries using nonviolence then turned around and used violence against their political opponents. Why did they do it? Part of it is they were handed the reins of power, a whole model of leading a political state that depended on violence. That's part of it. But part of it too is you can think that you have a fast solution. It's not a real solution, things faster. But you can be waylaid into thinking this is a fast solution. I'm just going to use violence, nip this in the bud. I mean, even Machiavelli, like just straight away kill your opponents before they can become popular, that kind of thing. And so some have turned to violence because of that. But there are other models for political science. For example, there's the non-killing political science, which is a challenge not just for individual countries, but for the world. We can have our governments take a step back, step by step by step, and mutual step back. And I challenge my own country, the United States, that uses violence a lot. Take a step back, nuclear disarmament, disarm a little more, death penalty, get rid of the death penalty. Start changing the prisons step by step. And so in this way, if you think, how can I be nonviolent in such a violent world? But what if we're all together taking a step back? A nonviolent and just society is our goal. And we can work for it in stages, I'd say.
Oh,
Thank you so
okay,
much,
thank you.
Gail. Let's turn to, yes, thank you so much for that reply, Gail. And thank you, Richard, for the question. Dasu, and then we'll go to Afiz. Dasu, please. You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you, George. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Gail, for your superb presentation. I'm not a philosopher, but I was trying to figure out some of the idea you have just presented. I would like to hear your intellectual insight about the notion of intellectual liberty versus ignoring social reality as propounded by Odera Oruka. My question is, what do you think this situation is still affecting African intellectual liberty, and what's the way forward?
Okay.
Is the question clear?
Yes, and now you're reminding me, I think an earlier question I didn't answer well enough, and it's related to your question, which is, was Odera Oruka realistic? He was staying in Africa. Moi was president. Can Africans really have this intellectual liberty? And definitely during his own lifetime, he felt the impingements on his intellectual liberty. Now, he still dared to express himself in many ways in the press and giving talks in his classes, but he definitely felt pressure, and he knew that he himself and his colleagues were under threat by, at the time, it was a single party government, and Moi had been president for many, many years. And Moi was known for taking faculty members into detention and torturing them. And this happened to some of his colleagues like Caspar Odegi and others. And Odera Oruka himself had his car searched, had his house searched by the police. They were looking for subversive material. Part of the reason Odera Oruka would sometimes, when he went abroad to conferences and he would find a trusted friend there, he would say, keep this manuscript for me because I don't know what might happen to me. Okay. And so that's part of how we find some of his works that he entrusted to others for safekeeping. So definitely it impacted his own life. He had many worries. When people criticized his book, he had to worry they were political opponents who might try to attack him, even though he talked in philosophical terms, but still it's a very political atmosphere. And so those problems of intellectual liberty, they still impact academics across Africa, around the world, and journalists as well. You may know, I mean, journalists are also having their lives threatened when they want to report on something that others don't want reported. And this is still affecting Africa. And that's why, I mean, Odera Oruka in his book on liberty would say, we need a broad democratic movement that safeguards both economic and political liberties. Okay. And he would talk about how the two are related. So sometimes he would find in his time, there might be, liberal political philosophies that focus on all the political rights and don't mention or don't include something like the right to safe drinking water, the right to sanitation. And the United Nations and other places that had lists of human rights were challenged, not only by Oruka and those from Africa, but also women who said, we need to challenge the way human rights is understood and realize we have these rights to thrive. Our economic rights are needed as well as our political rights, our free speech. What free speech do I have if you're my boss and I think I can't live without this job? If there was more economic liberty, I would have more liberty to speak out about my working conditions and challenge what my employer is doing. And that's true in academia as it is in other lines of work. So what's the best way to do that? Through solidarity, right? Through labor units, unionizing of faculty, for example. But I realize sometimes when you try to create a union, that's exactly when you feel the oppression and you worry you're going to lose your job. But if academic workers can be unionized, then if you're being singled out for dismissal, you can fight that. So.
Excellent.
Okay,
Thank you so much. Afiz, please go ahead. And then go to Janet.
Thank you so much. I don't have much comments, but I just want to ask, and thank you for the presentation. I just want to ask, is part of all these efforts by Oruka that he has sacrificed a lot of things trying to develop some idea to make Africa better? Can you say that in spite of all this effort, is Africa still better, or can we still apply the concept or ideology to make Africa better? And if we can do that, why can't we do that? And what is delaying us? What are circumstances standing behind it that is hindering the progress of Africa, in spite of all the sacrifices that people like Nkrumah, Obafemi Awolowo, many of the guys like Oruka that have sacrificed a lot of things? Why are we still backward in the world? Thank you.
Well, I mean, for me, I'm not a determinist, so I don't think that we're predetermined to either get better or worse. And I think when I look at the world, I see a mixed record. There's so many ways the world has gotten better, and so many ways it's gotten worse. And every day when I watch the news or when I read about history, I go, "Oh, that was so bad, so good that we're better now," or "Oh no, it used to be so much better, it's getting so much worse." And I have both responses all the time, but I think that's due to human freedom. It's like sometimes humans are successful in coming together, creating the good circumstances, and everyone is flourishing, and others can learn from that model. But then there can be other social forces, and what starts it? Is it resentment? Is it oppression? Is it, some kind of like, no, we have to destroy this good thing. Sometimes it's just competition. We're going to destroy your good thing because we want to be the only good thing around. So people have to come to us. And then perfectly good programs in some countries are sabotaged and stopped. And so these kind of things are happening all the time. And I think we have to focus on the wins so that we keep our hope, but learn from every failure and notice the causes and figure out how to reproduce more of the good effects.
That's well put. Thank you so much. Janet, please.
Thank you, Gail. You provoked in a good way so many areas of thinking. One is I just want to acknowledge the fact that in the United States too, we have this, we think we have upper class, middle class, and lower class, but there's a whole underclass that doesn't even really participate in the society for many reasons, like they're new immigrants or they're, quote, illegal immigrants, or they're just so impoverished, or their parents weren't really parenting them. And, so my husband worked with those people people like that in drug treatment, that they weren't even really parented. So we have all these levels of people in society, in I think every society, where that's an issue of how to incorporate them. That's the first point. And then the second point is that that I think my opinion is that if you want to have a post-revolutionary or post-regime democratic society with a preponderance of nonviolent methods, you have to be practicing those nonviolent methods before the regime change. And so that, I think that's what you're alluding to in South Africa. And maybe you could elaborate on that. How do we, we prepare for the world we want to be in, and nonviolence has a big role in that. So those are my thought questions.
Right, and I think that's also how Gandhi saw his project. It wasn't only just about winning at some big scenario where people are going to jail. It's all the preparation, the day-to-day preparation too. And he used to call it the constructive program. And he used to say, even if it looks like in the end we didn't win, we won because we learned. We learned how to communicate with each other, cooperate with each other, associate with each other. And so, yes, and so a lot of the wins in South Africa, I think, were due to the way in which people learned to work with each other, network with each other, and apply this large pressure, both nationally and internationally, on the government. And but at the same time, you have these things like small arms are flooding the area, etc. And a lot of times the things you try to do are undermined, and it's hard. It's hard to make sure that nonviolent momentum can stay, and so, of course, South Africa's had its ups and downs since the getting rid of apartheid. And there have been gains and there's a broader middle class, but it hasn't gone nearly far enough from the point of view of many South Africans. There's still too much poverty. There's still not enough sharing of the resources. There's still not enough egalitarianism. And so there's always the need to keep going. Sometimes people get tired. You can rally, when it looks like a crisis, then you think you resolve the crisis, you go home and you to your private life, and the task of remaking society is put aside. These are some of the problems with reaching the ultimate goals you want, and about how we need nonviolence in families as well. So I was just looking at, I was looking, George, at your series, and I was seeing how Donna Pito, it may have been a year or two ago, she addressed that same topic to your group, looking at the example in the family between sisters. And the one is, I'm going to punish my little sister. And then it's like the government, whether it's, this country did the wrong thing, I'm going to punish them. Instead of understanding each other, instead of coming to the table, instead of working together for flourishing, to find out how we can survive with the infrastructure we have and change it to become greener. Instead, we're just bombing the infrastructure and people have nothing, or they're rebuilding the old infrastructure. When we have current challenges that need world solidarity to make good changes for the future.
Thank you so much. And now we'll turn to Peter as we approach to close our session for today. Thank you. Please, Peter, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much.
Right.
What a wonderful presentation. And, Wole Soyinka and Chinua Achebe, I credit with saving my life when I was a lost teenager in Nigeria in an ordinary African school. The picture of Oruka in his khaki uniform brought back poignant memories. But I wanted to rant about Jeremy Bentham for a second. The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong. This leaves the poor to negotiate with the wealthy for a few crumbs. If everyone was comfortable except one family, that might be seen as a greater happiness for a greater number than if everybody without exception was slightly less comfortable. But inequitable distribution is inherently inequitable. It should have been an embarrassment the moment it was uttered. The utilitarian limits of possibility are not real. They're imposed by the question. Under the banner of Bentham, the proportion of people in desperate poverty doesn't seem to change much. But since the population increased threefold, the number of people left out of the greater good is staggering. As we approach 9 billion souls, the rest of us left over, left out, left behind are now number about 2 billion people. Actually, I've read now that it's 4 billion people don't have safe drinking water. For comparison, that was the total population in the year of my birth. Well, 2 billion people was all the people there were when I got to Earth 76 years ago, give or take a few thousand. Clearly, Bentham was scale blind. By that, I mean that without any cognizance of scale, Bentham might have decided it was better to build a canoe the size of a steamship because it would carry more people efficiently, but it would be absolutely unworkable. not everything scales up. So Bentham is a particular beef with me and has done tremendous damage. And the fact that people still buy that terrible lie, or let's just call it a scale error, is costing millions of people a decent life. Anyway, thank you, Professor Gail. What a wonderful work that you have. I've downloaded your documents and you've opened another horizon for us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. And maybe before Gail, if we could ask Wekne just for one quick comment or question, then you can close for us, Gail Presbey. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, George. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Gail Presbey for a wonderful presentation. I've enjoyed the presentation very much. And again, I would like to thank you for promoting and popularizing the philosophy of Odera Oruka. Thank you very much. And somebody also asked you, George, you should have checked the chat box, several questions. Why did they reject the novel of Odera Oruka? Did he send it to another journal? What happened to his novel at the end? Thank you very much.
Thanks. I saw that in the chat and I thought, but I could barely keep up with the chat, but I did see that one. Well, I'll answer that because it's got a quick answer, and then I'll turn to Peter's point. So the thing is, it was in safekeeping with Tommy Zane, and Tommy Zane was also a character in the book, and Tommy was one of Odera Oruka's closest friends. So Tommy knows, and we even have in some written like cover sheets of Oruka, that he submitted it and it was rejected, and he gave it to Tommy and he said, do you have any ideas how I could improve this novel? And so he intended to resubmit it, but Tommy admits he never got back to him with a way to improve the novel. Now, both Tommy and Odera Oruka loved African novels, and that's actually how they met. They met in a group in Uppsala that was reading African novels together, and Tommy was a philosophy student, and that's how Odera Oruka realized he loved philosophy and that he could switch from geology to philosophy because that's where his friend Tommy was studying. I think that it was just a matter of he was a beginning novelist and he only sent it to one publisher. I think there's a lot of people when you're writing your first novel, you think you have to send it to 20 publishers or 100, you have to keep trying. And he just got so busy that he never got around to rewriting it and continuing to submit it. And maybe if he did, it could have gotten published. But by the fact that he wanted it published, I thought this means he's not saying anything in the novel that he doesn't want other people to know. So even though it's unpublished, you know, I've been sharing what he says in there because it's not like it was a secret diary or anything. It's something he intended to have published, but he just didn't have the opportunity. And it would be great, I think, if it could be published now. And the family has a copy of it, and maybe they would decide to do that. I don't know. But in the meantime, I like to share, you know, some of the highlights of what it says, because it's an example of his philosophy. And I've only told you a little bit. There's even more in the novel. But about Bentham and utilitarianism. So, of course, there are times when Hedenius and Oruka sound like they're advocates of utilitarianism, but they're also critics. So at the same time that Oruka likes some aspects, he doesn't leave it alone. He tweaks it. And I think almost any contemporary utilitarian doesn't hold just exactly that maxim with no caveats. Every utilitarian has to put some guidelines and some stipulations, but we don't want one person to be killed so 20 people will be happy. You know, that those would be abuses technically allowable by a short version of the utilitarian maxim, but not what most contemporary utilitarians would want to hold. At least that's how Sturba tries to rehabilitate both utilitarianism and Kantianism by saying you have to admit the contemporaries have guidelines. And so, but even in his own life, he said, Mill, if you follow just Mill, you would have monopoly capitalism. You wouldn't have the rich-poor gap addressed. And he quoted Marx, and he liked a lot of the ideas of Marx. And so, I mean, it might be that a kind of Marxian adage like Honora O'Neill's, like to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability, would be something better than just the utilitarian maxim. And in fact, Odera Oruka tries to put guidelines on utilitarianism by saying there must be a moral minimum for everyone. You can't just put some people down to zero for the benefit of others. You have other very good points about the difficulties of scale, etc. So the small communities that Oruka grew up with, you know, they could have a better chance at making sure everyone in their community had their needs addressed. It's a larger problem for larger societies, but let's hope that larger societies can raise to the challenge of a fairer distribution of the resources, that it doesn't ask people to beg, but shows that it's a justice issue and everyone gets what they need so we can more easily live in harmony. So thank you all, and I hope you notice I put my website in the chat as well as my email. Many of my articles are available online. Thank you all for inviting me, and thank you all for your questions. And if you wrote something in the chat I didn't answer, you write me an email. I'll follow up with you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gail Presbey. And I thank everybody also for...
Sorry?
Yes,
yeah, I know that you were ending, but I would like to let you know there is one file which seems to have has a lot of spams. So I'm trying to caution you, don't download it, because my computer have this software. It has been detected that's the dangerous file. Someone who had sent this one called, I think it's among us, Daniel Manyasi. Do we have Daniel Manyasi? So
thank you so much for letting us know, Ngapemba.
Yeah. So it might be by mistaken, so that if you download this one, most likely you are going to have unknown viruses. We are living in this world of technology today and a lot of things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you so much, and stay in peace. Bye-bye.
Bye.